And a lot of this centers, of course, around the person of Muhammad. The Quran and Islamic tradition are quite clear and emphatic that he is the supreme example of behavior for Muslims to follow. The importance of Muhammad for hundreds of millions of Muslims worldwide is rooted in the Quran's statement that he is an excellent example of conduct, uswa hasana, which is in the 33rd chapter of the Quran, and that he demonstrates an exalted standard of character. The Quran even goes on to say that he who obeys Muhammad obeys Allah. This is something that any devout Muslim will take quite seriously. Muqtada Khan of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy put it this way. He said, "No religious leader has as much influence on his followers as does Muhammad, the last prophet of Islam. Muhammad, as the final messenger of God, enjoys preeminence when it comes to revelation, the Quran, and traditions. So much so that the words, deeds, and even the silences, that which he saw and did not forbid of Muhammad, become an independent source of Islamic law." So says Muqtada Khan, and in that he reflects the mainstream of Islamic tradition about the status of Muhammad. Now, it is also true that mujahideen, warriors of jihad around the world today, look to Muhammad and invoke his example to justify what they're doing. For example, as late as November 2003, the website of the Islamic Affairs Department of the Saudi Arabian Embassy here in Washington contained exhortations to Muslims to wage violent jihad warfare in imitation of Muhammad, and said the Muslims are required to raise the banner of jihad in order to make the word of Allah supreme in this world. Similarly, in December 2003, an Iraqi jihad warrior explained why he was fighting with American troops there in Iraq. And he said, "The religious principle is that we cannot accept to live with infidels. The Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, said, 'Hit the infidels wherever you find them,'" which is, of course, a quote not from Muhammad himself, but from the Quran, the celebrated verse of the sword, chapter 9, verse 5, which does say in part, slay the infidels wherever you find them. Fawaz bin Muhammad al-Nashami, who was the commander of a jihad group that killed 22 people in a jihad attack in Khobar, Saudi Arabia on May 29, 2004, explained very clearly that he was acting in accord with what he saw to be the Prophet Muhammad's directives for the Arabian Peninsula. He said, "We are mujahideen, and we want the Americans. We have not come to aim a weapon at the Muslims, but to purge the Arabian Peninsula according to the will of our Prophet Muhammad, of the infidels and polytheists who are killing our brothers in Afghanistan and Iraq. We began to comb the site looking for infidels. We found Filipino Christians. We cut their throats and dedicated them to our brothers, the Mujahideen, in the Philippines. Likewise, we found Hindu engineers and cut their throats too, Allah be praised. That same day, we purged Muhammad's land of many Christians and polytheists." Just before the 2004 presidential election, a Muslim preacher said, "Our prophet did not run for office in any election. He did not win any political debate. Instead, he won the war against the infidel." The examples multiply virtually with every new headline, every new news story coming out particularly of the Islamic world. In January 2005, in Arab News, the columnist Adil Salahi reminded his readers that Muhammad never waged war against a people without first inviting them to Islam. And he said, during the Prophet's lifetime, the Muslim community had to fight many battles. The Prophet made sure that in none of these battles, the Muslims would exceed the limits of what was lawful in Islam. He would not launch an attack without alerting the enemy and calling upon them to accept Islam and live in peace with the Muslim state. In accord with precisely those directives, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, recently sent a letter to President Bush, which he later explained to an Indonesian audience was indeed his invitation to Bush to accept Islam. And then he told Mike Wallace that, during his celebrated interview with Wallace, that the president, of course, had free will, but he should understand that if an invitation is refused, there are negative consequences. London Muslim leader Hani al-Sabahi in February 2005 justified the slaughters being perpetrated by the Mujahideen of Zarqawi in Iraq at that time. And he said, do these people base themselves on Islamic law or not? And then he answered his own question. He said, the Prophet told the Quraysh tribe, I have brought slaughter upon you. The Prophet drove nails into and gouged out the eyes of the people from the Uraina tribe. They were merely a group of thieves who stole from sheep herders, and the Prophet drove nails into them and threw them into the Al-Harara area and left them there to die. He blinded them, cut off their opposite legs and arms. This is what the Prophet did on a trifling matter, let alone in war. Now, these, of course, are all quotations, and I could give you many more, from Islamic spokesmen today. And of course, we have all heard that these people have actually twisted and hijacked the message of Islam, which is essentially and fundamentally peaceful. And yet, constantly, they invoke, again and again, the example of Muhammad, and they invoke quotations from the Quran. If you read, for example, Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, in which he himself invites us to accept Islam, on November 24th, 2002, you will find copious quotations from the Quran, invocations of principles of Islamic law. Now, this poses a challenge for peaceful Muslims, Muslim reformers, moderate Muslims, in the United States and around the world. Because this material is being used by the Islamic Jihad terrorists, it is incumbent upon Muslims who do genuinely abhor the terrorism that we see perpetrated in the name of Islam in the world today to stand up and speak out against these elements of Islam that are giving rise to these things and these understandings of the Islamic teachings and of the Quran that are being used to justify violence and terror. It is unfortunately untrue that the jihadists are a tiny minority of extremists who have hijacked the religion. The texts of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the madhahib, are very clear that it is incumbent upon the Islamic community, the ummah, worldwide, to wage war against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they either convert to Islam or submit under the rule of Islamic law. This is something that is shared among all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence and not rejected by any of those that are considered orthodox in the Islamic world. These things and many others arising from the example of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran as they are understood in mainstream Islam are precisely the elements of Islam that need to be confronted by reformers. All too often, however, in contrast, we hear from moderate Muslims that these elements of Islam do not actually exist, and that the people who are calling attention to them are bigots or hate mongers or something of the kind. Now, you know, there is religious bigotry. For example, in the mid-19th century, the nativist movement in the United States tried to perpetrate the idea that the Pope of Rome was planning to gain control over the United States through the Irish Catholic immigrants who were streaming into the country at the time. Later in the 19th century, in Russia, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were written, which of course is a completely fictional account of a meeting of high-level Jewish leaders who were plotting a large-scale conspiracy to control the world. Both of those things are indeed examples of bigotry and of hate-mongering, but they are such because they have one thing in common. They're fictional. There was no plot of the Pope to gain control over the United States. There was no meeting of the Elders of Zion to control the world. However, I have just given you a number of statements by Muslims themselves, and there are many others that are readily available. You find that it is not at all difficult, if you monitor the press coming out of the Islamic world, to find Muslim leaders invoking Quran, Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, and the example of Muhammad to justify warfare in the name of Islam, ultimately with the goal of establishing the hegemony of Islamic law over the world. Now, you can't fix what